This is the Cliff Yates Show. Personal growth, motivation, inspiration, and philosophies for a great life.
Hey everybody, this is the Cliff Yates Show. You're in the right place. And today we're going to talk about St. Albert the Great and the art of memory. I'm excited to talk about this. My mom and my wife, they always tell me, you have a photographic memory, which I really don't. I do put a lot of effort into memorizing things, and I had to do that when I was doing stand-up comedy, and I had to memorize my routines. But, you know, repetition is the mother of memory, and that's one of the methods that I used. And there are all sorts of methods out there to help us memorize names and things and items, and maybe you've heard of some of those techniques where you just start picturing one item leads into another. Let's say you gave me some items, a hammer, and then an umbrella. Maybe the hammer is the umbrella handle. And then there's dogs. Maybe then you picture dogs raining on top of the umbrella. And so now you have a chain that you can remember because you've made a visualization of it. But repetition is really the mother of memory, and that's when we have to really concentrate and focus when we want to memorize something. It's written that we have to become anxious about it, meaning we have to say to our brain, it's important to remember this. It's like when we remember someone's name. I know if I don't repeat it right away, either out loud or in my head, or I become anxious about it with my brain, telling my brain, this is important to remember this name. 5 minutes later, I won't remember that name, and I have to go back embarrassingly and say, I'm sorry, your first name again? Which I do now. I just don't get embarrassed about it. I just go right back to it because I don't want, if you wait too long, it's really embarrassing. 3 years later, you know what? I don't really remember your first name. But today I've been reading from a book by Kevin Vost. And little did I know, I'm looking at my library because I'm thinking, I really like this author. Little did I know that not on purpose, I had 3 of his books. And so the book I'm reading is about St. Albert the Great, who obviously was a saint, but he was so great, even when he was alive, he was referred to as Albert the Great. And he lived in the 1300s, 13th century, and he was a scientist. He's the patron saint of science, and so he was a scientist. He just loved learning about everything. He loved nature. When he got into something, he just wanted to learn how everything worked. Everything he wanted to know, how it came to be and how it worked. And he then became a bishop, and eventually he was canonized in the Catholic Church as Saint Albert the Great. Now, a lot of people I talk to, they haven't heard of Saint Albert the Great, but they have heard of his student, Saint Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas Aquinas was the student of Saint Albert the Great. Saint Thomas Aquinas, very well known, schools named after him, and very well known in the Catholic Church through his writings. And so they both use this method. There's a method Kevin talks about in one of his other books. He referred to it online. I was watching an interview with him, which he called the memory palace. So he liked to use houses, images of houses and rooms, and putting things in those rooms or naming those rooms, and that's how he can remember hundreds and hundreds of things. And he has several methods of doing this. And I learned today on the interview that I watched that he has several books on memory and different ways to memorize things. And specifically, he uses it to memorize biblical things and theologically in scriptures. And so, but this is something you can use for a grocery list. You can utilize this method not just for memorizing scripture, although that's what I'm kind of learning today. And this is going to be kind of what today's episode is about. When we use this method, kind of the memory palace is what Thomas Aquinas made famous, and Kevin Vost has gone into make it his own in utilizing his memory. He talked about if you went to a classroom and you ask, who has a great memory? All the kids are going to say they have a great memory, and the adults are going to say they don't have a great memory. But we all have the capacity of a great memory. And his method, when I was reading the book, he got this, he called it Tully's Art of Memory, which apparently was written by Cicero, a Greek philosopher back in the day. This is 2,000 years ago. Tully's Art of Memory that has proven successful in practice. And now Kevin Vost writes, for over 2,000 years, this has been a way to utilize our brains so that we can memorize things. And so let's get into it. I was fascinated when I first tried it. And so this is how I'm going to take you along with me. And so probably in the same amount of time that it took me, you're going to be able to do this. You're going to do it. So this is how we're going to do it. I want you to come along with me on a little walking trip. And let's start right now. We're going to walk up to this grand cathedral. And standing in front of the cathedral, we see St. Albert the Great himself, and dressed all in white, looking fantastic. And we're meeting St. Albert the Great, and we walk to the front doors of the cathedral, which are two giant golden doors. And engraved in these doors is not a cross or anything like that, but it's a giant Webster's Dictionary, engraved in gold in the front door. St. Albert opens the doors, and we get into the foyer of the cathedral. And St. Albert takes us by the elbow and directs us around a giant flask in the center of the foyer, filled to the brim with bright red wine. And then he leads us through a second set of doors, and just inside those doors to the left, we dip our hands into a water basin of holy water. And to our surprise, someone is washing a baby. And then we go and we sit in the back left pew. And we sit next to a lady who has some interesting garb on. And right next to our pew is a hole in the floor. And there's some stones around that hole. And there's a bucket indicating a well. And then we look to the front left of the cathedral. And we see a lectern covered by a porch and a small pool of water. And we look to the right of the tabernacle, and we see St. Albert is now there, and he is revealing 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And behind St. Albert is Jesus himself preaching, and there's a model of Jerusalem. And we look to the right of the cathedral, and a woman is running towards the confessional booths while stones are flying past her head, and she's fleeing to the confessional booths for safety. And above the confessional booths are beautiful stained glass windows. And the stained glass depicts a man, and the rays of sunshine are streaming through the eyes into the cathedral. And in the back left of the cathedral, we hear and we see baying sheep and a shepherd. Now, I'm going to reveal to you what we just memorized. We just memorized the first 10 chapters of the book of John. I was amazed by this. If I tried to sit down and try to memorize these chapters, I would have to think about them and, repeat it over and over again. Just by telling the story, going on this walk with St. Albert the Great, in 10 minutes, I had memorized the first 10 chapters of the book of John. Let's go through the trip that we took, right? We met St. Albert at the front doors, those golden doors with the giant Webster's Dictionary. That's number 1. It goes along with John 1. The book of John 1. Got a giant dictionary full of words. John 1 is the Word became flesh. God was the Word, and the Word became flesh. John 1. Now, this is a way of memorizing the chapters. It's not every word verbatim in those chapters, but it's a great way to memorize the chapters. Then we walked through those doors, and remember in the foyer was the giant flask filled to the brim with red wine. And that represented John 2. That reminds us of Jesus and the first miracle of turning water into wine at the wedding of Cana. And then we walked through a set of doors. And to the left, we put our hands in the holy water, and we were surprised by someone washing a baby. That represented John 3. We must be born again. Then we sat down in the pew next to the lady, and we had the well. That reminds us of John 4, when he revealed himself to the Samaritan woman, reminding us that he revealed himself not only to the Jews, but to the Gentiles. Then we looked to the front, and we saw that lectern with a porch over it, surrounded by a small pool. John 5, the pools of Bethesda, where Jesus did healings. And then we looked and saw St. Albert with the 5 loaves of bread, the 2 fish. John 6, reminding us of Jesus' multiplicity, where he fed the thousands with just the 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish. And behind, John 7 reminds us that Jesus went into the temples and preached himself. And then we looked over. Remember, we saw that lady running to the confessional booth with all the stones flying around us, reminding us of John 8, where he refused to condemn the woman accused of adultery, and everybody wanted to stone her, and he refused to condemn her. And that reminds us John 8. John 9, because now we see, you remember above the confessional, the beautiful stained glass windows depicting the man with the rays of sunshine going through his eyes. Book 9, reminding us of when Jesus restored sight to the man. Now remember the back left. We looked and we saw those baying sheep, reminding us, John 10, we are the sheep, and Jesus is the true shepherd. And so, in a matter of a few minutes, by creating this story and these images, we were able to memorize the first 10 chapters of the book of John. You could go backwards, right? I know John 7 is going to be Jesus went into the temples to preach. I know that already. I already know John 3, we must be born again because of the baby. I can go right back to the baby that's being washed in the basin where we dipped our hands in. Once you know that story, you can go backward or forward. Now, you could use that to in any way you want to. This is a memory tactic that Kevin Vost uses to memorize scripture and different chapters of the Bible. He used it to, he created a memory palace to memorize the 7 virtues, to memorize, he created a house with these rooms to memorize the 10 commandments. He created these images from the front door to the hallways to, he would just, picture, walking into this house. He would just make this up in his head, right? You walk into the front door, there's a picture of your mom and dad on the wall. Why? Honor your father and mother, right? On the right side, on the wall, there is a gun rack with a padlock on it. Thou shalt not kill. See, as you create these things, and you can make these tactics personal to you on however you want to do it. And then you can add things to the room. You can keep the same house, the same church, the same cathedral, whatever you use. And so I was excited when I was able to do that today, even though my mom and my wife tell me I have a great memory. I thought, I went through that once, and then I knew that. But there was no way, without using that tactic, that I would have memorized the first 10 chapters in the book of John as well as I did when I did that. And I'll probably never forget that. Kevin Vost was talking today that, the longer amount of time that you go from using that or those images or that story, the more you're apt to forget it, but if you just need to refresh yourself a little bit, it'll bring you right back to everything you've memorized. And that was just 10 items. But he was demonstrating today. He was showing how he memorized 75 names in the matter of a few minutes and knew where what number was attached to each name. And he did that in one of his classes when he was a professor at a university. So I'm excited to be using this method to learn and remember more about the Bible and scriptures. And I'm going to use it for other areas of my life. And I'm also going to, because now I remember, I'm going to buy more of Kevin Vost's books because he's got several on memory. Memory is very important. So I hope you enjoyed this episode on St. Albert the Great and the art of memory. Thanks, everybody. And if you're listening and or watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. Please leave me a comment on the YouTube channel. And if you're listening on one of the podcast platforms, please subscribe to the channel. And I will catch you at the next episode.